Welcome to what we hope will be a dynamic discussion on trust and accountability, bringing values into our future, which is part of the 27th annual conference of the International Environment Forum and co-sponsored by the Wilmette Institute, the Baha'i International Community, and the EBBF, which is the Ethical Business Building the Future organization. The panelists today are Daniel Perel and Sylvia, please forgive me, Sylvia, Winkhuizen, correct? Okay. And I'd like you both to give us a brief introduction to yourselves, starting with Daniel.
Good morning, afternoon, evening, everybody. I'm Daniel Perel. Peril is the thing that we try to avoid. Perel is the thing that we are listening to right now, unfortunately. So anyhow, I serve as a representative for the Baha'i International Community's United Nations Office. I sit in New York City, where we have the General Assembly Week ongoing right now. So security is tight, and Zoom is a wise choice. So I represent the BIC as it's known here, which means we try to share the learning and experience of Baha'i communities and their collaborators around the world, as well as reflections from the Baha'i writings, which speak to values such as the oneness of humanity, truth and trustworthiness and justice, and all of these sorts of things. We try to share those to the best of our ability with our colleagues across the street at the United Nations, in the hope that we can create a better world together. I've been here for about 13 years, and it's been a real pleasure and honor, and I'm looking forward to the conversation today.
Thank you, Daniel, and maybe over to Sylvia now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Sylvia, and I am based in the Netherlands, in a small village close to Wageningen, where I work at the University of Wageningen as an associate professor. And my field is really political science and looking at to seek to understand how global governance works, what international agreements do for action at the national level. And I'm really interested in exploring concepts of legitimacy and accountability, both in my research, but also in my education. I engage a lot with students who are very concerned about the state of the world and who really want to contribute to changing it. And for them, I think it is really essential to learn how global governance works and doesn't work at the moment, particularly, and what avenues there are to strengthen it. And I'm also a member of an International Environment Forum, which is one of the organizers of this conference, and a Baha'i-inspired NGO that seeks to explore how science and values intersect in terms of supporting environmental improvements. So it's a pleasure to be here, and I also very much look forward to the conversation.
Okay, thank you so much. We are hoping that today's discussion will also be a useful component in the paradigm shift towards shaping a better future, as urged by the Secretary General of the United Nations recently. So I'm going to come back to Daniel now, and would you like to please now take us on a little bit further?
Sure. So I think what I've been asked to do is kind of two separate but related things. The first is to situate us in terms of the context of the current conversation about the future of the United Nations, multilateralism, and things of that sort. And then the second is to offer a few thoughts on notions of trust and accountability. So that's a little bit of the roadmap that I've been asked to bring us down, and I'll do my best. So a few years ago was the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. And on that occasion, there was a lovely political declaration, as it's known, which was drafted by the member states, which outlined 12 points, 12 essentially promises of what the international system will do for the people of the world. Things like prepare for the future and work with youth and promote gender equality, a number of the principles that we try our best to stand for. And in that document, the last paragraph asked for a report from the Secretary General on kind of a roadmap going forward to be delivered 1 year later. So in 2021, the Secretary General issued that report, and it's known as Our Common Agenda. And in our common agenda, there's a wonderful, what I would say, analysis of some of the shortcomings that the world is facing today, followed by some prescriptions or proposals for how to get over a number of these shortcomings. And while I think it was a valiant attempt, I actually thought that the description of some of the challenges we face was excellent, and I really commend that to your reading. But in terms of the recommendations, what I took from it was that there seems to be a lack of imagination in terms of what's possible for the future, a lack of vision, perhaps. I mean, there's descriptive visions. We want a future in which people aren't poor, there's no poverty, there's people aren't hungry. There's a lot of anti-negative descriptions of the future, and the positive is just sort of a flourishing society. But I think that we can maybe go a little bit further in that regard, and in that sense, that's some of the work that we try to do here. So anyhow, he issues this Our Common Agenda report, and in that report, he articulates that there will be 3 upcoming summits. One of them was a summit on education to be held in September of 2022, a summit of the future to be held right now, and then a World Social Summit to be held in 2025. Now, the World Social Summit is at the 30th anniversary of the World Social Summit in Copenhagen in 1995. So 30 years puts it at 2025. And one issue that comes up when the Secretary General calls for big meetings like this is that the member states have to agree. So they agreed on the education one. They had some trouble with the Summit of the Future idea and actually kicked that down the road to be in 2024 with a ministerial meeting happening actually on Wednesday of this week. And the nuances of what is a ministerial meeting don't really matter that much, but the actual summit is taking place 1 year hence, and then they have not yet agreed on the World Social Summit. But all this to say, there's a bit of a roadmap and a bubbling conversation about the future of the United Nations and government's commitments to their people. One key element of that Our Common Agenda report and of the processes that are ongoing is a pact for the future that is meant to be articulated by the member states. And that pact has 5 chapters, one of which is on youth and future generations, a new agenda for peace, architecture of the multilateral system. And so part of the work of the next year will be to articulate what all of these things mean. And this is really vital and a great opportunity for us because it means that we can add perspectives to the best of our ability and to the degree in which they're willing to hear it, but we can add our perspectives into the dialogue. In fact, this morning, there was just a meeting of a bunch of sort of behind the scenes role players in the conversations around what's called the Declaration on Future Generations, which is part of the Pact for the Future. To really figure out how do we want to roadmap this next year and what do we see, as successful. If we were to fast forward a year, what would we want to look back and say were our successes? So the conversation is bubbling. And one of the key issues that seems to arise time and again is this issue of trust. And so that's what we'll dive into in a moment. And I realized that I forgot to mention another small role that I play, which is as co-chair of this group called the Coalition for the UN We Need, which is a civil society network coalition, as the name implies, of people who are thinking about and trying to write and learn about what is the United Nations we need, and then how can we work towards it. And so this coalition is essentially taking the Our Common Agenda process and trying to add a civil society voice to it. So that is sort of a role that we're playing, which is really interesting and exciting. So let's get into a little bit of the trust and accountability dimensions. And, when I think about trust, my mind doesn't often go straight to the intergovernmental space. It usually goes to, my family. I trust my mother, and I trust my wife, and I trust my kids. And that's an important dynamic. And I think we should hold on to that as we're talking about trust. What is it that makes us trust these people? It sounds a little bit ridiculous to question it, but actually the principles that underlie it are pretty important. And even when we are, doing very basic things like joining this meeting, well, how did we get here? What did we need to trust in order to be here? Well, you trusted that I would show up on time. You trusted that the link would work. that you would get the appropriate information, that your alarm clock would wake you up, that your babysitter would take care of the kids, whatever it is, there is an element of trust that underlies all of our actions. Yet, unfortunately, this kind of trust doesn't really extend in the same way at the international level. And in fact, we are seeing a breakdown in trust with almost any institution at the moment, of media, governance, medicine. We see all of these basic foundational elements that you used to take for granted as being questioned. And it's okay to question them, because whose truth is truth? And I think this is a really important question that even before we articulate new institutions and new functions of a global governance body, we really have to interrogate this issue of trust. The Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, identified that there's a growing global mistrust. And I think this is an important thing to acknowledge. But then once you say that, we have to figure out, how do we build trust again? We can't just say there's this lack of a thing and then move on. And I think this is where this kind of conversation comes in. How do we take the knowledge of growing mistrust and move forward effectively? One struggle I see at the international level is that we speak about what's missing. There's not enough food. There's not enough emissions reductions. There's not enough money. There's not enough rights. There's not enough accountability. And this is really important to identify. But imagine if you keep on talking about the things that you don't have, and then you try to build something new. It's really hard. We can't build anything with the tools that we lack. We can only build with the tools that we have. So then let's return to why we trust our family members. Where is trust to be found? And how has it been built? And then how can we replicate that at the international level? In order to build trust, we have to start by thinking about these relationships where trust blooms, whether this is with our mothers, fathers, close friends, religious leaders, teachers. It's present because of a joint commonality of interests between all those who are involved, this sort of tacit agreement that we're on the same team, a solid relationship created over time, and then the keeping of promises. So if my mother tells me she's going to do something, unless something intervenes, that will happen. And if something intervenes, I can trust that there was something that intervened. I believe her when she says something. And yet we don't see that with many of our institutions. And sometimes it's because our institutions have lost our trust. They haven't demonstrated trustworthiness. And in other cases, it's because we seek other narratives that may be more convenient or more aligned with what we see as our values. The Open Society Foundation has this barometer that they put out every year. And the 2023 barometer showed that older generations...
Excuse me, Daniel, a moment. We have a question here from one of the participants. He wants, Robert, he wants you to please define what you mean by trust and how it is different from hope and expectation.
Sure. So trust, and I would link it with trustworthiness, is the ability to believe what somebody says and that they will do the thing that they have said. So you can trust in someone that if they tell you they're going to show up at a coffee shop at 2 p.m., it's not hope, because hope, you can sit at the coffee shop for hours and they may or may not show up. You can hope that they do. But if you've agreed on something, they've given you their word, then you trust that they are going to do it. And it's not aspiration either, because it's essentially a promise made and a promise kept. So in this barometer, it showed that older generations trust democracy and institutions far more than younger generations, which demonstrates that there's a clear breakdown over time in trust in our institutions. And why might this be happening? Well, one reason, and there are many, I'm sure, institutions aren't finding a commonality of interest. There's not this consensus that's built between the institutions and the individuals. They're not building this genuine relationship with the citizenry. You need to have a relationship in order for there to be trust. You can't trust in someone if they've never given you your word, and giving your word is that undergirding of a relationship. And most unfortunately, they're making promises, or many of the institutions that we see are making promises that either cannot or will not be fulfilled. There are other dimensions as well, but perhaps we can keep it here. Maybe just to refer to that question again, trust implies some degree of action on the part of the relationship. You don't just hope that someone will do something, you're willing to act on that feeling, that trust. Like If they say I'll be there at 2, you will also show up at 2. If you hope they'll be there at 2, you may or may not. So apologies for the sort of the tangent. But I think one thing that might be helpful is to think a little bit more deeply, not at the conceptual level, which I've articulated a bit, but some of the practical effects of this. So if we want to build trustworthiness, let's just say that in a relationship of the international community with the citizens, or among the international community, if we think about trustworthiness as a goal, then any promise made would have to be a promise met. I mean, that just has to be part of the trust building process. So this $100 billion promise, which many of you are likely aware of, it came out some years ago that the high income countries said that they would provide $100 billion a year for climate funding. But it's been, I think, 7-8 years since that agreement, and we haven't yet reached that number. Now, we are all aware that $100 billion isn't going to solve the climate crisis. And so the fact that they haven't met that $100 billion is actually not so much about the money, because the money is insufficient anyway, but it's about a promise made and then broken. And that's worth much more than $100 billion at the level of the international community, especially when the gap is actually not that large. If 86 billion has been given, we're missing only 14. And I think the amount of trust that we could build by actually making good on that commitment, or having made good on it years ago, would have gone a lot further. It's essentially an investment. It would have gone a lot further than just the money itself. Another element that we would have to look at in order to build trust is one of justice. And justice looks different through the lens of different nations. That's part of our diversity. It's also unfortunately often warped by vested interests. What might be justice to one person may not actually be justice objectively, because there's some sort of vested interest that's underlying it. But all this to say, we need to establish spaces where these elements of justice can be spoken about openly. And a breakdown of this justice can actually result in the weaponization of different arms of the UN to prevent action. We can talk about the Human Rights Council. We can talk about this idea of what are known as unilateral coercive measures, which is another word for sanctions. And these are actual concerns that I think are legitimate, but they sort of become weaponized in the negotiations because there's not a meaningful place for conversation. And so in the area of justice, and if we just look at the climate change issue, if we look at countries that have historically polluted and benefited tremendously from an unjust system, there's a different set of capacities and responsibilities that arise for those nations. They have greater resources, they've had greater impact. So then the question is, what does that ultimately look like from a trust building perspective? Saying all this is, in a nutshell, to say that we cannot ask the people of the world to just trust their institutions blindly based on nothing but good faith. There needs to be this element of trustworthiness. And how do we measure that? Well, I think we need to be considering points of accountability. And I think Sylvia would likely have a lot more to say on accountability than I ever could. But if there is no accountability, then it's hard to trust. I mean, it's sort of this monitoring. You know, if somebody says they'll be there at 2 o'clock for coffee and they don't show up, I'll text them and I'll call them. I'll say, where are you? And I hold them to account. And so next time I may trust them less. And that sort of accountability mechanism doesn't mean that we're no longer friends, that you can't mend the relationship. But accountability as it's understood at the international level has become kind of a weapon. And that weapon actually serves to break down the trust that we're really trying to use accountability to build. So it tends to be considered in this negative light. But how can we think about shifting that accountability narrative to one that is more hopeful? What might it look like? We'd have to develop shared values and recognize that these global issues are mutually harmful or beneficial, whatever we're looking at. Stakeholders would then be more inclined to follow through if we have that sort of meeting of the minds. A shared accountability model can be the foundation for policies based on reciprocal interests, creating commonality between strangers, which, in quotes, strangers, between different actors, which when followed would bring some positive results, and when ignored would bring detrimental harm. So I think the last thing I'd like to just add a couple more quick points. I know I've been speaking for a bit long, sorry. It would be helpful to think about collaborative vision and values like trust and accountability, solidarity beyond borders, selfless service, the consideration of future generations, all of these elements, which are maybe the soft dimension of governance, they actually form the foundations it's not what you see when you look at the outside of the multilateral system, like the edifice. You don't see these foundational elements because they're down deep. But they have to be discussed, or else the whole thing will topple, or it won't even stand in the first place. So this is what we're hoping that the Summit of the Future, this 2024 gathering, can help us to advance. Notions of trust and trustworthiness, of accountability that may be different and better suited to the times in which we find ourselves. If we think of the international system like a tree, the roots, they draw upon the soil, which is the people, for their vision and values. And without them, the tree can't exist. The trunk has to be these characteristics of trustworthiness and justice to bring those values into reality. And with those, we can have the leaves and the branches and the fruits produced that we wish to see. So that would be sort of the output. We have the values and vision of the people feeding this trust and trustworthiness and justice, and then it produces some really nice results. But how we create those systems are quite difficult. And I know Sylvia is actually a certified expert in doing so. So I'm looking forward to her maybe more practical contributions and then an open dialogue afterwards. So thank you very much, David, and all for your patience with me.
Very fascinating. Thank you very much, Daniel. I really enjoyed that. Let's go over to Sylvia now.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure I can honor your expectation or trust in me, Daniel, about delivering practical hands-on solutions. I'm going to dive a bit more into the values that the roots that you were talking about. So let's see, maybe in the conversation after we can go into these a little bit. So I wanted to start with a quotation from Abdul Baha, who lived more than 100 years ago. And he said, "Today, no state in the world is in a condition of peace or tranquility. For security and trust have vanished from among the people. Both the governed and the governors are alike in danger." So this was certainly valid in his time, but it prevails in many places today. The lack of trust, as we have already heard excellently from Daniel, is abundant in global governance, including in the field of environmental sustainable development that I mostly work with. There is lack of trust among states, who are the main decision makers. We already heard an elaboration of that. There is also lack of trust from those governed, citizens of the world, in the ability of the current system of global governance to deliver the kind of solutions that we really need to address both immediate, urgent solutions, whether it is a nature disaster or the very long-term deep problems of the world in the sense of biodiversity loss, climate change, etc. And the fact is, as we already heard, that global governance is just full of broken promises. States promise and do not deliver. And when I talk about this with students, I refer to it as the global goal setting dynamic, which basically we have seen in a number of rounds. So we have seen states adopt a very ambitious collective goals that they want all of us to agree together. Yet they do not stand up and take responsibility for their part in meeting them. So the goals and targets are set for a particular year to be fulfilled. And when you come closer to that year, the states engage together with the UN system in a process to evaluate usually the lack of progress, maybe some marginal progress here and there. But this evaluation tends to be quite superficial and very generic, and not really go into the reasons of why progress hasn't been made. And after that very superficial evaluation, that one is shoved under the carpet, and you move on to set even more ambitious goals for another year in the distant future. So this example really shows that the states get away with these broken promises. They are not held accountable for them. And of course, this erodes trust even more. But there is a very intentional design behind here. States are very careful not to create any proper mechanisms through which they need to be held to account, either by each other, by other states, or even more, a judicial body. So they do a bit of reporting every few years on how what they do to act on these global goals. And those reports, they are public. They may be discussed, in very short public sessions for a small crowd who bother to listen, but then they're generally forgotten. And they write, and they're never they're very seldom scrutinized by experts, these reports. In a few cases under the Paris Agreement and climate change, they are, and a few other international agreements. So you have this public political process of judging the collective performance of all states on the goals. We have just seen this around the SDGs this year, where the end event will be this week with a summit of heads of state to actually look at that performance. The collective evaluation of the progress towards the Paris Agreement is taking place as we speak, and is also going to end in December this year at the Conference of the Parties. But at these processes of kind of collective evaluation of progress, they are very careful to avoid organizing accountability mechanisms for individual states' behavior. It's kind of okay to say, well, we all failed, kind of, because then everyone can hide behind that collective failure. But if you had accountability for individual states' behavior, you would require some kind of follow-up. And in some agreements, you have that discussion of individual implementation reports, but then usually with the conditions that that discussion is very kind, facilitative. And this can also be meaningful. It's important to have that conversational space to evaluate what has been done, to learn from others, etc., if countries took this process very, very seriously. But usually that is not the case. So if we sum up, we have in global governance a very dysfunctional dynamic between trust and accountability, because the main actors, they distrust each other, at least on a community and institutional level, and they mostly refuse to accept any type of formal accountability relationship towards anyone else, despite the fact that their actions have dire repercussions on people and nature far beyond their own territories. So the resulting lack of accountability reinforces distrust among states, but perhaps even more among people, which leads to the risk that we lose whatever trust we may have had in global cooperation. And this is of course super serious. Now, in the absence of proper formal structures of accountability that we can see to some extent, at least in domestic contexts, even if also there many governments get away and get off the hook when they break their promises, it becomes even more obvious that the role of values of truthfulness and trustworthiness of those who are in authority are extremely important. Because in essence, if there is no one to keep you on your toes, to actually call you up if you didn't show up to that coffee, you really need to do it yourself. As a governor or as a government, you need to hold yourself to account in that vacuum of you haven't let others do it. And the Baha'i international community said the following in a statement in 1998. Those who wield authority bear a great responsibility to be worthy of public trust. Leaders, including those in government, politics, business, religion, education, the media, the arts, and community organizations must be willing to be held accountable for the manner in which they exercise their authority. Trustworthiness and an active morality must become the foundation for all leadership if true progress is to be achieved. Moral leadership, the leadership of the future, will manifest itself in adherence to a single standard of conduct in both public and private life, for leaders and for citizens alike. Okay, so if your country has signed up to the Paris Agreement on climate change, which virtually all countries have, if you're a public official working for the government, or even as an individual, and you commit to its and you seriously commit to its objectives, you can create regular processes to reflect on your own contribution to meet these goals, so that you also then can adjust course accordingly. So this would involve self-accountability, holding yourself to account as a state, as a government, or as an individual. And such self-accountability, however, it only works if you are able to manifest a certain degree of the values of truthfulness and trustworthiness. At least that's my proposition. Now, how, you may ask? So let's look at these two values one by one. Let's start with truthfulness. This foundation of all virtues essentially means that you love truth for its own sake. Truthfulness begins with being truthful to yourself and, of course, to others. And it implies, as Udo Schäfer once pointed out, that there is a state of harmony between one's thoughts, feelings, and intentions, and then one's actions. So any effort to pursue a goal, especially those that are difficult to achieve, which we should not, which are clearly the global goals that we have adopted. So every effort to pursue them requires being able to truthfully track progress, including failure, and make honest evaluation of what is not working, what is working, and why, as a foundation for learning and for improving and adjusting course. And avoiding to analyze failure, for example, which happens very much among public actors in global governance and certainly at other levels as well, makes no foundation for improving policy along the way. And the opposite of truthfulness, untruthfulness, Schäfer points out, involves deceiving oneself, constantly seeking excuses. And this is kind of a non-starter for self-criticism and improvement. And I think we can agree that global governance is kind of more characterized by untruthfulness than truthfulness at the moment. And then moving on to trustworthiness, which we already heard Daniel talk about. I mean, this is really a value and a character trait of our souls that lay the foundation for trust among people and nations, between governors and those governed. So BIC in another statement said trustworthiness is a vital characteristic of governance. It's the source of true accountability. Now, to be trustworthy implies the obligation of keeping a promise or a pledge. And Baha'u'llah calls trustworthiness, quote, a stronghold to the city of humanity, end quote. And he also called it, quote, door of security for all that dwell on earth, end quote. And referring to both these fundamental values, Baha'u'llah stated, cleave ye at all times to the court of trustworthiness and hold fast to the hem of the garment of truthfulness. In a tablet that Baha'u'llah addressed to members of parliament, representatives of the people in the world, he said the following: it behooveth them, however, to be trustworthy among his servants, and to regard themselves as the representatives of all that dwell on earth. In these words, we can really find the bedrock for the future of global governance. Trustworthy representatives of the people that actually do not only look at the interests of those who elected them, but who see themselves as representatives of all that dwell on earth. So when we have achieved this, we can create a system of global governance that serves all of humanity, presently living and those in the future, as well as all other life. And those were my starting off comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sylvia, for that. I hope we can now bring Daniel back, and perhaps the two of you can have a bit of dialogue about these things.
Yeah, so I'm looking at a couple of the Q&As here, and you know, I'm trying my best to watch the chat box and the question and answer. I think this I'll take it in sort of reverse order. I like this last question. I like all the questions, but there's one from Robert who says, would you please comment on why emphasizing trust, which cannot be quantified, as opposed to consequences, which can be quantified? I think that this is a really helpful point, and I don't think it's an either or, as you know, most things in the world aren't, and I'm not suggesting that you think they are, but we have to do a little bit of both. If we can't measure it now, it doesn't mean we'll never be able to. We can find proxies essentially that would show whether or not trust is being built. I don't know exactly what they would look like, but if what we're trying to do in many spaces is kind of monetize a number of different dimensions. I mean, we know that they try to say, oh, a tree is worth this much money for how much carbon it captures and how much, you know, oxygen it puts into the air and all of these things, which, you know, has its uses. I think we have to think about other ways of measurement. I mean, this monetizing thing is something that wasn't natural, perhaps, generations ago, but now it's something that we've done. So we do have to emphasize trust, even if we can't measure it, because it's sort of the foundational elements that underlies every agreement. And then consequences, of course. I don't think that we're saying we shouldn't be looking at the consequences of our action or inaction. But we have to make sure that the way that we look at the consequences are ways that are trust building. You know, for example, if you get a question wrong on an exam in your school, you're not embarrassed and sort of lambasted, and everybody knows that you've made this mistake. I mean, there's a trust and you know, an underlying assumption that you are trying your best, which may not be the same underlying assumption with member states here. I recognize that. But if that were the case, then the way that we do accountability wouldn't be, you know, if you make a mistake, then it gets painted all over the front of the newspapers everywhere, and you're made to look like a fool, essentially. It would have to be a little bit more loving. So how we deal with these consequences is something we need to think about. And I do recognize that there's an assumption here of right relationships, that we're trying to do the right thing, which isn't always shared. But if we're talking about the ideal world, the world that we wish to see, the future that we wish to see, let us caveat and sort of more parking lot this idea of nefarious actors. And just imagine if the world were full of good actors trying to do the right thing. What would the systems look like to encourage and accompany that kind of a relationship? Sorry, that was just one of the questions. I appreciate all of them, but I'll let Sylvia jump in if she would like.
I thought maybe David might also engage in bringing together some of the comments. I can also look at the questions. But maybe following on what you said, Daniel, I think absolutely that research has also showed if you go into the kind of maze of relying on very kind of sanction-based accountability systems, that's actually that can erode trust. Then you're really that's a foundation for you don't trust anyone, and you have to hold everyone to account all the time, and that's not a foundation for good relationships. But rather, and I do think that, you know, whether they are not, even if they're not called accountability, when governments engage in processes of follow-up and reporting and discussing evaluations of how they are doing, and they explicitly say, you know, we want to do this in a spirit of helping each other to do more. I think we shouldn't only look at that as a cynical kind of, yeah, they're doing that because they don't want anything else, but rather take them for the word and hold them to account for actually being serious about wanting to help each other. And that's what I'm looking a bit in my research, and how can you then design those accountability mechanisms in a way that they actually are meaningful and we can learn. And you know, and those who are not implementing because they don't have the capacity to do so, how can you then help them build that capacity, etc. So to have an atmosphere of honest learning and sharing of each other, and not being afraid to share failure and learning from that, that's the direction to go for.
Right. It's just some mistakes that nations have made in the past have caused conflict with other nations. And it's this conflict resolution that's really important. Every nation has its own educational system. They have their own history, and history differs. Even when they're talking about the same period of history, you'll get different perspectives. And so you get different ideas, and then you get conflict, you get distrust. And we need to find a way to bring that back, because in this multipolar society we have now, there's so little trust. How can we begin to build this tree you were talking about earlier on, Daniel, for example?
Yeah, that's a great question, David. And it actually resonates very much with a question that Elena asked in the chat box about steps toward
Yes,
a meaningful space.
I was
Yeah.
referencing that as well in my mind. Yeah, fine.
Perfect, perfect. So we are on the same page. So yeah, this idea of meaningful space is really interesting. So first, let's think, okay, right now, everything that happens across the streets, just in theory, is sort of recorded and it's on the record. And so you think about the role of the ambassadors, well, now they're on the record with everything they say. And the way that our political atmosphere exists right now, if you say something exploratory or creative, or a little bit against the orthodoxy of the country that you are representing, it actually may have consequences on your career and on your family's future. I mean, it's really hard. If everything's always on the record, it's really hard to be creative and exploratory. So let's take that as one thing. Now, I'm not saying that every conversation should take place off the record and that we shouldn't have this, but we need a little bit more forgiving record, like civil society and the media who watch it. Oh, I understand this was said in an exploratory tone. I'm not going to quote them and get them fired because but we weaponize any deviation at the moment. And that's something that we, as an accountability source, have to be careful about. Then you have the conversations that take place behind closed doors that aren't seen publicly. Well, then we have to think about what is the role of the ambassador at the moment? Well, it's to represent his or her country. Now, countries have interests that, of course, are going to be diverse, and they may at times run counter to the interests of human well-being as a planetary system. And I think that here's where I referenced in my response to Elena, that this is the fundamental assumption of the current international order, which is based on state sovereignty and member states putting themselves at the center of their own objectives. So you can understand that a country would say everything needs to be invested in X, when in fact, from a global and from their perspective, that may be true. But from a global perspective, it may be actually Y with a peppering of X for that country. You know, it's not to say that anything is black and white, as they say, but we don't think of it this way. We just conceive of our role, and this actually goes for civil society, it goes for political parties, it goes for member states. We conceive of our role as representing this position, and that my job is to get the best results based on my position for my constituency. That is actually really difficult in a world where we are one family on one homeland. Imagine, you know, if your whole family's together for Thanksgiving and one person just is saying it's my way or the highway, that's not going to result in a good family relationship. And now we are confronted very clearly with the reality that we are one family on one planet. We've seen that time and again, no matter the crisis, no matter the sort of emerging technology, it's all based on one system. And yet our governance is broken into 193 constituent elements at a minimum. That doesn't include civil society and all these others, you know, corporate actors and everything, who are working for their group. And so I think we need to actually have a moment where we can question that as well. And so there's a lot to unpack, and it's a long process. But if we're not having the conversations, and this is a bit my fear in the Our Common Agenda report, if we're not willing to open up this conversation in an exploratory way, then we're not going to get to the answer ever. If you don't ask the question, the answer is always no, right? So let's start asking that question and having that conversation.
Great. I think we are having part of that conversation right now. Let's see. I think there are 3 more new comments coming in from questions and answers. Let's see. Oh. Bella Anis, have you seen this in the questions and answers? Is talking about a practical strategy. How can we develop a practical strategy to encourage this kind of cooperation that's lacking just now, for example?
Maybe I can take an effort at that. Building on Daniel, it's a long process, and I actually do think even if the ambassadors or the diplomats or the people who are engaging in these processes do come there with representing a particular country, particular interest, they also do become part of a community and they make friendships across these interests.
Yeah.
And it's clearly to see that there are these moments where they come together and they kind of raise above those interests, and are really, because they're staring it in their face, that if they would stubbornly stick to that, it would all fail, right? So, but those moments don't occur often enough, and particularly there's this disjuncture of what you do when you come home, because there's one thing if you have developed this understanding for this global context in the global meeting rooms, and then you came home, and if the structures and the political system or the public discourse is not welcoming such a universal oriented perspective, then reality hits, right? And all the other interest and partial interest and the polarization starts. So for me, that just brings it to the realization that it is a very long process, and it really has to start with the next generation as well, the ones who could internalize this perspective from early age and have this more of part of their identity when they enter these spaces. And we need to become more of us who would give our leaders the right to take a more global interest, and to really ask them to prioritize that.
Yeah, yes, that's for sure. I mean, we can think of a few examples of young people today that have really stood up and spoken truth to power as well. And that's very important, because I think when we have these international meetings and people represent their own country, they're coming with an agenda that's already set out for them previously. It's already agreed on before they even enter into the negotiations. They have a set understanding of how far they can go, why they can't overstep something or not. They have to keep within the confines of their brief, basically. And that's what makes it so difficult. You mentioned that people can break out of that occasionally. They're almost accidentally sometimes, yeah, becoming friendly with someone who should be an enemy. Yeah, and it's such a natural thing to do, to want to make friends when you meet in a gathering, right? But if that person has already been identified as the enemy, it's a little bit difficult to come out of your shell. So how can we break out of these shells? That's my question.
Yeah, it's so interesting that in these conversations, it so quickly boils down to relationships, right? That's where it gets down to, is how do we know each other? How do we understand each other? And how can we strengthen our bonds of genuine friendship? And I think a couple of things to consider just sort of come up in my mind. And I recall there was this great contribution that a colleague once mentioned, which is that we are blessed with a vision to try and see the truth in a dimension of what anybody says. So we have the capacity to find something that we agree with, even with those with whom we may say that we always disagree. So take the white nationalist who is threatened by the influx of what have you, whatever story or narrative they might be telling about white nationalism. But there is a dimension about history and our tradition and our values and our culture that it's important to retain that cultural element of who we are. And if one is seeing that being taken away, then boy, that causes a reaction. We see that in if I use that narrative of elements of our culture being taken away, most people think of in this country maybe indigenous communities. And we have real empathy for that. Oh my gosh, you're right. In the course of history, your culture was really removed violently from you. What a shame. And how can we reinvigorate it? And part of it is a recognition of that history and maybe an accuracy of the read that is very helpful. And with the white nationalists, maybe there's not a great reading of what's actually happening, but there is something there about a fear that's legitimate. And if we can identify that fear and say, you know what, I see this or I hear this in what you're saying, though I disagree with maybe your means or your, the course of action you wish to take, here's what I'm hearing you say that I can actually resonate with in some way. And I'm not saying that we go out and we, get in all these crazy chat, rooms with certain ideologies that may not be constructive, but we do have to see what is it that they're really saying, what is at the heart of it. And in any disagreement at the UN, we can see that it's often about relationships, and it's about trust, and it's about justice and history, and acknowledging that and finding points of agreement as our starting point. I think it would actually go a long way. What if, and I wrote a piece on this about hope, but what if at the beginning of every intervention, member states were kind of required, or the culture was, that they would acknowledge the truth of someone with whom they disagree before just disagreeing with them. It's sort of like in a classroom, you're supposed to give constructive criticism, not just straight up criticism. Whereas right now, the tradition is that you start by articulating that the whole world is going to, the bad place in a handbasket. It's going there fast, and we have no way, and it's all your fault. That's sort of the tradition of the UN right now. But what if we started to shift that? I'm not sure what would happen. Maybe not a lot, but I do think that people would start to have a little bit more hope. Those relationships would be a bit stronger, and those maybe immeasurable dimensions that were referenced earlier of trust can start to be considered and built. And this also might help, Arthur's question about motivating political leaders when partisan politics encourages the contrary. I think that's very true, that we have this culture of competition that really encourages us in some ways to move in nefarious directions because of different tribalisms and what have you. But if we start to change that culture in our behavior, I don't know, I do think that it would have a meaningful impact on the tone of these meetings and allow us to think creatively. I know that it's not like a silver bullet. If we just have this institution, then the whole world will be solved. But it comes down to relationships. And so what are the skills that a marriage counselor might say would help a couple that's having difficulty, or a couple of 193 couples who are having difficulty in their relationship? Maybe we should listen to them.
Yes. Wow. Okay. Did you pick up on any of the other questions and answers? There are a few people are contributing now to this. I'll just give you a minute to have a look.
Yeah.
That you may like to comment on, either of you.
Well, I mean, I also think that we have painted a very black picture here of lack of trust, of broken promises, of a very negative dynamic, which very much of it is real. But I do think we have to acknowledge the very positive starting point, that there is this ability to actually agree on how the world would look better, what we want to do, the world we want. And I think that's a genuine agreement which we can build on. It's really illustrating a unity of thought in what we want to have. Where the differences come is, what is each our role, who has more responsibility, how we're dealing with injustices in access to resources and these kind of very serious things. But we do have starting points. And I think all of us in our national, local context it serves as well to pay attention to what the international community does and agrees on, and make our serious contribution to that. Because even I would say that, for example, if we look at the Sustainable Development Goals, even if everyone really, pulled all the resources and really tried, they are extremely difficult to reach as well. Anyway, these are complex social issues, many of which are interlinked, etc. So even with the best of will, they are hard and take time. So we kind of have to recognize that as well, and also be engaged in the process of identifying what are the root causes for these our challenges to move ahead in the right direction to meet these goals.
Yeah, I think one of these root causes is fear, right? And I think you fear something if you don't fully understand it. And it means you have a lack of information really to guide you to make the right decisions. When you stop fearing someone or something, then you become more relaxed about it. And then you can open up, you can flourish. I think you used the word flourishing earlier on, Daniel. we need to learn how to flourish. Yeah, because there are so many negative things that are thrown at us every day, particularly through the media. And even without trying now, every day of the week, there's something bad happening in the world. And we're coping, we're trying to catch up with it always. But if we got together as a planet and we started looking at how we could settle some of the problems between ourselves, we could concentrate on what a lot of the real problems are, which, you know, I mean, as a member, I'm also a member of the International Environment Forum, and I care very much about the planet I'm living on. My God, I'd rather live here than on Mars or Venus, you know? I don't want my planet to look anything like those two neighbors of ours, right? I fear that it could happen, right? But I have trust in humanity enough to believe that somehow we'll get it together. And I hope I'm right, because I'm not. We're in for a pretty awful ride otherwise. So, Daniel, I think you've been reading again. Is there anything else you've come up with?
I was in a meeting this morning. I have two thoughts. One is that I was in a meeting this morning, and I mentioned this idea about some skepticism around the Summit of the Future, and somebody else in that meeting mentioned, that there's essentially a false equivalency that we have a tendency to create with any dissenting opinion. What I mean by that is the truth may be one thing, and 95% of people believe it, and then 5% don't. And yet we acknowledge those 5% because we don't want to sort of hurt their feelings in a sense. And this individual who was essentially saying, let's be careful about how we approach this, was saying, look at where the climate discussion was 20 years ago, where there was a false equivalency of, some people don't think it exists and some people do. Of course, the science was 95% sure at that time, and now it's 99.99% sure. And yet we have this tendency of creating this. And I think we have to just be willing to say the thing and trust each other to just call it as it is, because otherwise, we continue being sort of apologists. And if we need the world to change for the better, which we absolutely do, then I think we have to recognize that. And I say all this in part to say that while we speak about how terrible the world is and the trust and all of this, we also should be honest that we would probably all prefer to be living now over 100 years ago or 200 years ago, because the world is a better place. Our survival rates are better, our technology is better, our food is better, all of this, it is improving. I mean, of course, we know the food systems are like all kinds of bad things, of course, are happening. But there it is. There's that false equivalence, because the world is objectively a safer place now, and a place where we are more likely to survive longer now than a while ago. And we have a lot of people to thank for that, a lot of excellent work. And so it's not that everything is horrible. Many things are, and that's what we seem to highlight. But we have to be careful not to have this sort of self-fulfilling prophecy about how everything's going to be horrible. And that voice is loud enough across the street. What is it that we can add that may be different? It's one of hope. It's one of optimism. It's one of positivity and truth. And I mean, speaking to relationships and being good people. The reason this office, I serve at the Baha'i International Community, which represents a relatively small portion of the world. And yet we have a really outsized opportunity here, and people trust us and believe us. And why? Because for 75 years, we've done our best to speak the truth for the good of humanity and not just for ourselves. And I think those sorts of things demonstrate that now this space that we have the privilege to host, there's 60 people meeting in the room next door to me right now. We can do it because people know that they're not going to come here and be berated with, an aspiration that they all become Baha'is, or that they see the light of, what it is that we're trying to do. They know that we're just working for the betterment of humanity. And that, in a sense, is what it can and should boil down to. And I think if you do that over time, you build this tremendous trust. We've had meetings where very diverse actors have been in our office together, having profound conversations, because they know that things that happen here stay here. And that's a wonderful privilege. And we see it. We see the trust is being built.
Yeah.
There was a comment here about specific guidelines to help build relationships. It wouldn't be for me to say, but I do think, and we've seen some studies from people who've done a bit of this work, that if you can get participants to agree on ground rules for consultation and conversation before they actually have the consultation and conversation, it actually really helps. Don't interrupt each other. Be nice to each other. It's basically the kindergarten rules that go at the front of the classroom. If we did that, at the beginning, let's just remind everybody that we're here working for the benefit of humanity. We have the great privilege of trying to serve 8 billion people with the outcomes. Let's not interrupt each other. Let's be positive. Basic rules. I think it would just change the tenor.
Daniel, you just gave me an inspiration there. I mean, you talk about kindergarten. Very young children don't really have any prejudices. They have to learn them as they get older. So they will trust anyone. I know it's difficult and it's dangerous for children to do that, but it seems to be inbuilt from birth. But we then educate ourselves away from trustworthiness and we learn to be suspicious. Yeah. And not trusting in people. And of course, there are always people around that will prove it to us as well because of their actions. So it brings it back again to the very same thing you said before about relationships being so important. But on a global scale, this is where our problem is. We're in large scale meetings and conferences and things, and it's not very intimate. And I think you need the intimacy between people who are vowed enemies. And as soon as you get them round the table together in a situation where they feel very comfortable, then their defense mechanism kind of breaks down and they become a little bit more human, right? A little bit more giving to others.
I can give an example linked to a question that Arthur Dahl asked about the Talanoa Dialogue, which was a process under the Climate Convention in 2018 to kind of have this collective evaluation of progress and then readjust course and muster some political response to that. And the process was really designed by the Fijians who were chairing the process at that time. And they brought in a cultural concept of dialogue that they had very much in the Pacific area, which is this kind of collective decision-making for the public good, which excludes criticism and a negative, sanction, negative comments of others, and rather builds on storytelling. So they designed a process where they actually engaged the diplomats in this process. So they created this kind of intimacy with small groups sitting in rooms, maybe 10, 13 people, facilitated by someone from the Pacific Islands who are experienced in this kind of consultation approach, and with very strict instructions to not criticize other countries, but rather focus on storytelling and this kind of conducive to the collective process. And that was a very interesting experience. And I know I spoke to one of the delegates in the break of this process and asked how he experienced it. And he said, it was so different. This was just a friendly conversation. Usually when we negotiate, we always have to hide things from each other. So
Sylvia, I think that's a really fantastic way to bring things to a conclusion here, because I think we've hit the nail on the head there. It's just the implementation of the process that's so difficult to try and get it into formal settings. Really.
Well, and also the characters of those engaging in the processes, they still have to
yes, characters
learn how to be truthful, how to be trustworthy in those conversations.
Yeah.
And that's of course a process and a growing process. And it's more comfortable to do in your own local and family and local community. But indeed, that is what is necessary.
Absolutely, I agree with you. I hope everyone who has taken part today has benefited from this discussion, and they feel that they've contributed something to it as well. and that we can together make a better world if we approach it in the right way with the right set of values and the willingness to listen to others and to see it from another person's point of view. I think that's probably so important to us as well. Yep. And I think I'd like to bring this to an end now, if we can, unless there's something you want to round up with before we go. We still have a few minutes left.
There's one question, actually, if I could just jump in. There's this question from anonymous attendee.
Okay, I missed that, sorry. Yeah.
Who writes, how can we encourage people with a strong sense of moral and spiritual values? And how can we ensure that that applies to country representatives at the UN? And one thing I think we should be considering is that all of us have a strong sense of moral and spiritual values. The question is, how can we ensure a sense of consistency between those things that we may practice in our personal lives with our loved ones and our children and parents? How can we make that consistent with the way that we behave at the UN? And I think that there's an element to that humanity has to shine through in all of them. And so to assume that the folks here don't have, and I'm not saying that the anonymous attendee is assuming this, so apologies to anonymous, but to assume that those folks across the street don't have moral and spiritual values, I think actually we are recreating the very atmosphere that leads to mistrust, because we're saying, oh, that's not a person with strong moral or spiritual values because they're saying X, Y, or Z. But in fact, they have those values. The question is, how can we ensure that those values shine through despite some of the very challenging political questions that are constantly being raised across the street? And that, to me, is the fundamental issue, is bringing that humanity into these spaces to help us build the relationships, tap into something bigger than ourselves, and ultimately demonstrate trust and trustworthiness.
And perhaps expanding our vision as well at the same time. And
Can I just,
yeah, sorry. Yeah, Sylvia,
just to add a couple of sentences on that, and just to expand that, I'm truly convinced that many of the ambassadors to the UN and many who engage in this, they of course have these values, but this plea that Daniel said about being consistent between your values and your actions, that applies as much then in the context we are talking about to the domestic context, because that's where action has to be taken. You know, the agreements are made in the UN, but the implementation, that's where a lot of the improvement has to be made. And that's where we also have to focus our attention.
Yeah, we have private and public lives, and we need to be the same person in both of these spheres, really. Yeah, I would agree. So, thank you so much for today. I really personally got something out of this. It was great. And I hope that everyone else has done so as well. I think it might be time now to bring things to a close.
Thank you very much, David, Sylvia, and everybody.
Right.
Thank you.